This presentation is brought to you by a partnership between the Northwest Research and Extension Center in Mount Vernon and the WSU Regional Small Farms Program that serves Clallam, Jefferson, and Kitsap counties, and also many farmers who've participated in on-farm research and have given their feedback. Our sweet potato research and educational presentations and materials are generously funded by the Western Sustainable Research and Education Grants. These grant programs are funded by the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. I'm Laurel Moulton, and I work with Integrated Pest Management with the WSU Regional Small Farms Program. I'll be your host today. Our presenters this evening are Laura Schulz, who's a WSU PhD candidate at the Northwest Research and Extension Center, and Sammy Greger, who manages the on-farm trials. Also joining us today, and they might pitch in to answer some questions, are Jordan White, who's a master's student at the research station, and Carol Miles, who's a professor and vegetable extension specialist in Mount Vernon. This presentation will be recorded and housed on the WSU Regional Small Farms YouTube channel. Since you registered for this event, you'll receive an email with links to the recording and other educational materials mentioned in this evening's presentation, and also an evaluation form. We'd really like your feedback on this presentation, so look for that and send it back to us. For the presentation today, we'll have breaks through after different sections for questions. So put your questions in the chat box and we'll get to those between sections and at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura.
All right. Does my screen look okay, Laurel? Okay, cool. So as Laurel mentioned, I'm a PhD student at WSU. I'm based at the Research Center in Mount Vernon, and we have been working very closely with Laurel and Sammy for the last 2 years on sweet potatoes. So today we're going to give kind of an overview of growing sweet potatoes in Western Washington, and a lot of this is applicable for those of you outside of Western Washington, in Central or Eastern Washington, and even in Oregon as well. So sweet potato is a tropical perennial crop. It produces edible tuberous roots, which is what it is most well known for, but it also produces edible leaves and stems. We have seen a lot of grower interest in sweet potato in Western Washington and across the Pacific Northwest. It has been increasing in recent years. A lot of farmers have been experimenting with sweet potatoes on their own or as part of our trials. And there's a lot of reasons farmers are interested in sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are a very nutritious staple food crop. They have relatively low nutrient requirements, especially low nitrogen. And sweet potatoes are in the Convolvulaceae or morning glory family, and there are no other crops in this family. So for farmers looking for a crop for crop rotations, sweet potato is a great option because they are not growing any other crops in that family. And then I just want to mention that sweet potato is a very heat and sun-loving crop. So when you're thinking about growing sweet potatoes and you're thinking about how you're going to grow them and where you're going to grow them, it is key to remember that sweet potatoes need a lot of heat and a lot of sun. The sweet potato production in the United States is primarily in the southern states and California. California is the 3rd top state overall, and it is the top state for organic sweet potatoes. However, sweet potatoes can be grown across northern latitudes of the United States. We have a few factors that help promote higher yields in northern regions. First, we have really long days in the early summer in northern regions like Washington. And in sweet potato, those long days promote vine growth. So we see our sweet potato vines grow much more vigorously and more quickly in the early summer. And then in the fall, we get really, really short days. And in sweet potato, that promotes root bulking. So it's kind of this nice combination of really long days in the summer. So we've got these really vigorous plants that have a ton of leaves on them. And then in the fall, the plant quickly switches into focusing on root bulking, and it's got all of that foliage growth to send sugars into those roots. And then in areas like Western Washington, where it's a little bit cooler, we typically use plastic mulch to increase the soil temperature, and that is going to increase the yields quite significantly. So with these three factors, we have seen across 2 years of trials in Mount Vernon, sweet potato yields at the national average. So the national average in that graph is that blue line. You can see 4 of our 6 varieties were at the national average yield. So we are totally able to achieve very high sweet potato yields in the Pacific Northwest. There are lots of types of sweet potatoes. So this picture is from a taste test we did earlier this year. Some of you may have participated in. There are a lot of different skin colors of sweet potatoes, ranging from white, yellow, orange, brown, pink, red, and purple. There's lots of different flesh colors, white, yellow, orange, and purple, and then in between. And there's 2 primary flesh types. So sweet potatoes are typically either moist type or dry type. And moist is the typical orange sweet potato you buy in the United States. It gets very soft after cooking and is very sweet. And then dry type is the flesh type preferred in most regions of the world outside of the United States. And it is a little bit starchier, it remains firmer after cooking, and it is generally less sweet. So there are lots of different sizes of sweet potato roots. And I mentioned earlier that sweet potato is a perennial crop. And that's really interesting because it means that the roots are never going to technically mature. So if you're in an area with a warmer season and you let them keep growing, the roots are just going to keep getting larger and larger and larger forever. They're never going to stop growing. And so what this means is that if you're targeting a specific size class, so like maybe you're trying to grow fingerlings or you're looking for slightly smaller roots, you don't want to sell the jumbos with your direct market, you're going to want to watch when you harvest. And if you're in a really warm area, you might actually be harvesting a little bit earlier than you have to make sure the roots are your desired size. So I'm just going to talk about 4 common varieties we grow in Western Washington. So Covington is the #1 fresh market sweet potato variety in the United States. It has pretty high yields. It's the standard orange sweet potato. Unfortunately, it is very wireworm susceptible, which we'll talk about again in a minute. Beauregard was previously the #1 sweet potato in the United States, but it was overtaken by Covington a couple decades ago, primarily because Covington has slightly more uniform shapes. However, Beauregard does seem to be a little bit better suited to northern areas. So we do, and other studies across northern areas of the US generally find Beauregard has slightly higher yields than Covington. So it's a great one to consider for our region, but again, it is wireworm susceptible. Bayou Belle is the highest yielding variety that we have tried in Mount Vernon. It is widely grown in the United States for processing. It has super high yields. It can produce very large sweet potatoes. They're very, very good tasting. However, I've heard it is not able to be sold in commercial markets because the skin is too dark red. So that's not really a concern if you're direct marketing, but that's just why it's primarily grown for processing on a large scale in the US. But it is a great option. And additionally, it seems to have a little bit of wireworm resistance. So it's not quite fully resistant, but it's kind of moderately resistant. And then Cascade is a new release, which was named after the Pacific Northwest region. It does have much lower yields. However, it is a completely different flesh type. So it is a white flesh and it is a dry flesh type. Generally, just due to lack of breeding attention, we find that the white, yellow, and purple sweet potatoes are much lower yielding than the orange ones. And then additionally, Cascade is wireworm resistant. So it's a great option if you have wireworms. We have found in Western Washington that wireworms are the primary pest of sweet potato. Wireworms are the larvae of click beetles, so it's a really general term. It's referring to this whole family of beetles. And they feed on the sweet potato roots as they first are developing in the spring and summer. And then as those roots grow, they kind of grow around those feeding scars and can create really, really large scars on the roots at harvest, which you can see in the picture on the right. They do generally tend to be pretty shallow scars. So it is considered a superficial damage. There's no worms left in the root. And we don't see any impact on storage life as long as roots are properly cured. But it is can make the roots completely unmarketable depending on where you're selling them. So for a home gardener, this is probably not going to be that much of a concern because you know that there's no insects left in there. But if you're trying to sell your sweet potatoes, wireworms can cause huge crop loss. A few things that you can do to help with wireworms, if you can try to avoid fields that have recently had grasses or clover. Both of those attract the adult click beetles to lay their eggs. So for example, like a recently converted pasture is probably not going to be a great spot for sweet potatoes. Annual tillage does reduce populations of wireworms. So if you know you're in a field that you till every year for vegetable production, chances are your wireworms have dropped quite a lot. And then if you know anything about the history of wireworms in your field, so wireworms affect lots and lots of different crops. So if you're a farmer, you might know whether or not you have wireworms in a particular field. So just be aware that they will also affect sweet potato. And then in addition to those three things, there are wireworm resistant varieties. So here is a picture showing on the right is Covington, which I mentioned is susceptible, and it's the most widely grown cultivar in the US. And then on the left is a breeding line developed by the USDA breeder in South Carolina and tested in Mount Vernon. And you can see grown in the same field, it has a lot of resistance against wireworms. Cascade is the most wireworm resistant variety that we have available for farmers right now. It was bred by Phil Waddle, who is the sweet potato breeder at the USDA ARS vegetable breeding program based in Charleston, South Carolina. It was tested by WSU in Mount Vernon, Washington from 2019 to 2024. And based on our field data, the breeder decided to do a dual release. So it's a dual release by the USDA and WSU in 2023. It is not under patent, so it is available for farmers to freely propagate. And probably quite a few of you have already grown Cascade, or you will be receiving it this year. So Cascade, just a few facts about Cascade. It has a dark rose skin, which fades in storage. So the top right picture is right after harvest, kind of a dark pink skin. And then the middle picture is after 6 months of storage. So it kind of fades to a lighter colored pink. It has creamy, mild flavor, yellow flesh. It is a dry flesh type, so it is kind of unique eating quality. Sorry, my computer appears to have frozen. Let's give it a second. Oh, sorry. Okay. Here's the rest. Sorry about that. So Cascade also has very vigorous vine growth. It produces dense canopies. It does have yield lower than commercial standards, but as I mentioned earlier, it's very common for yellow and as well as purple flesh sweet potatoes to have lower yields than orange right now. And Cascade is a very prolific, fast slip producer. So a lot of farmers really appreciate this if they're producing their own slips on farm. And Cascade's resistant to wireworms, as well as other soil insect pests that are issues in the southern states, which we don't have yet. Oh, sweet potatoes are propagated by slips. So the sweet potato roots that have been stored will eventually start to sprout in the spring. We put those in potting mix in the greenhouse, and they produce slips, which are vine cuttings. So there's no roots on the slips, they're just vine cuttings. And then those are planted directly into the field. Then at the end of the season, the roots are harvested, they can be stored, and you can produce more slips again the next year. So sweet potato production indoors looks a little bit like this. So we start with a tray with some potting mix. We place the roots on there. We cover them partway with potting mix. We place a plastic dome on top to help retain humidity and heat. And then we place that on a heat mat in a heated greenhouse. And then as those slips start to sprout, when they get large enough, we'll take off the plastic dome. And then once they are fully grown, we cut the slips. They'll kind of like that. And we do not recommend cutting leaves off the bottom of the slips. If you've been following our work for a couple years, you might remember we used to recommend that, but we did a trial last year and found yield was quite a bit higher if we left those leaves on. And you can watch the video linked with the QR code if you would like to see this whole process. So a big question we get is how many slips am I going to get if I produce my own slips, and how long is it going to take? So we've done now 2 years of experiments, and we've found on average you're going to get about 7 to 10 slips per root. And on average, it takes about 6 to 8 weeks to produce slips in a heated greenhouse with heat mats. If you're in a cooler area, like an unheated greenhouse, or you don't have heat mats, it could take quite a bit longer, maybe even up to like 12 weeks. But there is some variation by variety. But in general, we see 7 to 10 slips per root in 6 to 8 weeks. So I'm going to let Sammy jump in here and talk about pre-rooting slips.
Yeah, I'm going to take over just very quickly and then I'll hand it back to Laura. But I have been playing around with pre-rooting slips because a lot of farmers, I'm primarily working with farmers on the Olympic Peninsula, and it's pretty chilly here. We have a lot of pretty complex microclimates, and so pre-rooting we have sort of been finding the last year or two may help extend the season because it basically, could you go through the words for me,
Oh,
Laura?
yeah.
You're good. Um, so the main reason we went to is that last year I had about 3 farms where we planted some that had pre-rooted slips in them and some that did not. And we found, it's not official data, but generally that the yield seemed a little bit higher on the slips that were pre-rooted. And the biggest difference is that the wilt after that we see after you transplant slips into the fields was a lot less dramatic when they had some roots on them. The downside of this is that if root bound happens, which is roots can grow pretty quickly, especially if you have a nice warm greenhouse. If those roots start to get bound, that can lead to irregular roots at harvest and a little bit more difficult to get them out of the soil. So that's something to consider. This year in the bottom corner, this is a little grow coon. So this is a biodegradable plant-based polymer that I'm getting a trial of, and it's a way to help prevent roots from getting root bound. So we're playing around with some methods, and I'm really excited to share with you all at the end of the season what we learn, and if we can give you more official recommendations around pre-rooting. All right. And then this just moves into the importance of preparing your fields to make sure that you're giving the sweet potato plants that heat-loving environment that they need. And in Washington, basically using a soil warming mulch is essential. These are pictures from Mount Vernon's research of comparing the bottom, the photos. There is mulch over the course of 3 months, and at the top, it's without mulch, and you can see the difference in the amount of greenery is pretty substantial. And this is proved to be true. This is from the data from our on-farm trials last year out here on the Olympic Peninsula. And each category is a different type of mulch used. So the recommended traditional version that will get your soil the warmest is that black plastic. A lot of farmers out here wanted to either use biodegradable plastic or recycled silage tarp, things like that. Those helped as well. As you can see, yields were definitely higher, and where the yields were the lowest was when no soil warming mulch was used, and that we had basically no marketable crop size. So that's sort of what we've been learning, the importance around soil warming mulch.
So we're going to take a quick pause if there are any questions at this point.
I also was able to, if you all need to watch that slip production video, the link is now in the chat. It's
Awesome.
very cute and very informative.
And there currently are no questions in the chat box.
Awesome. We will move on.
Oh, wait. Actually, one just came in. When do you plant sweet potatoes?
Well, that is what we're going to talk about next.
Okay. And then the next one is row cover, asking about row cover to warm the soil.
Sammy, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so we've had a few farmers play around with some above ground warming. It is definitely row cover can help give the greens more of that humid and warming atmosphere. However, we are trying to figure out if using row cover blocks some of the light because it's a very light sensitive plant, and that can be a downside of using row cover. I don't think from what I have seen, row cover gets the soil as warm as having actually that black colored plastic and or weed cloth, touching the actual soil itself. I've had some folks that have their soil warming mulch on, and they also are using the green or the plastic slitted hoops or row cover over that. And if you're in an area, especially with like a lot of deer or things munching on your greens, that has been really helpful.
Okay, a couple more questions have come in. So, do you use black plastic if you're planting your sweet potatoes in a high tunnel?
Some farmers out here did. The ones that did plant the high tunnel last year with plastic, I think had more of a watering issue. I'm excited though. There's a farmer out on Bainbridge this year. They're going to do high tunnel and they're not going to use plastic. So I think this year we're going to get a test. I would say from right now, from what I've seen, you still do sometimes. I think you would need plastic still in a high tunnel, if, at least if you're farming out in the peninsula. It just doesn't get quite hot enough. But we're gonna play around with it. I'm excited to see what people find out.
The other
Okay.
thing I'll just say about high tunnels, feedback I've gotten from farmers who've tried sweet potatoes in high tunnels, they generally said they probably wouldn't do it again just because their high tunnels are such valuable real estate. And sweet
Right.
potato, it's a great crop, it's a new crop, but the value is just quite a bit lower than other high tunnel crops like tomatoes. So if you're kind of weighing a really small amount of space in your high tunnel, you might want to put your sweet potatoes outdoors with black plastic instead.
Okay. The next question is, have there been any trials with other colored mulches?
So not sweet potato trials, but we do know a lot about soil warming with other colored mulches, and we have a lot more information about that in our growing guide, but basically black colored mulch is going to be the best option for soil warming and weed control. Clear mulch can provide almost the same warming, but it does not control weeds at all. So for that reason, we use black plastic.
Okay, and there's been no research on green plastic. There's some green and brown and
So
white.
I think there has been in other crops, and many of them just don't warm the soil as much, and some colors of mulch even cool the soil.
Yeah. Okay. The last question is, where can you order Cascade slips?
Oh, awesome. You can contact us, and we might be able to get you some. So depending on where you are, you can contact Sammy if you're on the peninsula, or you can contact me if you are not on the Olympic Peninsula. And if you contact the wrong person, we'll send you to each other. So just contact one of us, and hopefully we can get you some Cascade slips still this year.
Okay. I think we can. Oh, and last question is, are the Cascade slips organic?
So some of them are, yep. Some of them are certified organic. I have kind of a mix.
Great. Okay. Onward.
All right. So now we are going to talk about plant spacing. So within a row, plant spacing with actually like any crop, a couple principles we're just thinking about. We want to put our plants close enough together in the row that we're not wasting any space, but we don't want them so close together that there's excessive plant-to-plant competition, which will lower yields. And generally, what we see is if you put your sweet potato plants closer together, you're going to get lower yields per plant, but you're going to get higher yields overall to a certain point. So we have done trials on this in Mount Vernon, and the results show on the left, you can see root yield we found was highest at 10-inch in row spacing. Root size does continue to increase with wider spacing between plants. Generally, we recommend 10-inch spacing for Western Washington, but if you're in a much warmer area where the sweet potatoes are just likely to have much higher yields over the season, you might want to put them a little bit further apart, maybe 12 inches or even 15 inches in some areas. Or if your goal is for larger roots, you might want to put them further apart. And then again, for if you're in a really cold area or you want smaller roots, you could put the plants a little closer together. Spacing between rows is totally just equipment dependent. So in our trials at our research station, we use a tractor for mechanical weed control. And so we have to make sure that our rows are far enough apart to allow that equipment to move through. So we put our rows 6 to 9 feet apart, but typically in the southern states, they do about 3 feet apart. But this is really just dependent on your equipment and whether you need to get in there to weed between the rows. And then just a quick mention that there's a couple different growth types of sweet potato. There are spreading varieties, which are shown on the left, and there are erect or sometimes marketed as bush type varieties shown on the right. And there's only a couple bush type in existence so far. I think there's maybe like 4 or 5 released so far, but this is an active area of breeding. And the bush type help compete with weeds earlier in the season, and then they stay nice and tight near the row so they can allow for between row weed cultivation later in the season. We grow our sweet potatoes in raised beds for 3 reasons. For soil warming, for soil aeration, and for easier harvest. So another thing to think about as you're selecting a site for sweet potato is to think about the soil type. So you might not have control over this, but just so you're aware, especially clay type soils can negatively impact yield. So in these pictures, you can see on the left, sweet potatoes grown in clay-like soils can often get misshapen. You might have lower yields overall, and it can make harvest really, really difficult, especially in the fall once the fall rains start. Whereas in sandy loam soils, harvest can be really easy, roots are nicely shaped. So you might not be able to control your soil type, but if you know you have a clay soil, you might want to watch really carefully when the fall rains are going to start. Make sure you get those harvested before your soil gets like cement. Okay, so life cycle of a sweet potato. This is just kind of a little diagram showing you from when we plant, typically around June 1st in Western Washington, to when we harvest, typically around the first week of October, just so you kind of know what to expect with your plants. So for the first 4 weeks, which is usually the month of June, that's when sweet potatoes go through the establishment phase. So there is rapid root growth going on underground, but almost nothing is happening above ground. So it might look like your slips are literally just sitting there, but just know that that's completely normal. And then for the next period of about a month and a half, which is pretty much July until mid-August, we see rapid vine growth. The vines are going to get to their final length, and the initial storage roots are going to be initiating underground. So it's during that stage that the plant is kind of deciding how many sweet potato roots it's going to make. And then the final month and a half or so of the season, so mid-August until October, is the root bulking phase. So the vines completely stop growing, and they are just sending sugars down into the roots to kind of bulk up those storage roots for harvest. So planting slip, as I mentioned, typically we aim for around the first week of June. Sweet potatoes are very cold sensitive, so there's really no rush to be getting them in sooner. They really need soil temperatures at 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So here's a picture, and there's also a link to a video showing how the most efficient way we found for planting, which we learned from a farmer on the peninsula. So this is a piece, there's Jordan there holding a piece of rebar bent, so there's a little handle at the end, and you can kind of stick that straight through the plastic mulch, make a nice deep hole, and then slip right in. And then main thing to watch for is just make sure you irrigate immediately after planting, so the slips don't have any roots on them, so they're really susceptible to wilting, and they really need water right away. Wilting or dieback of the slips after planting is totally normal. So the slips didn't have any roots, they're experiencing severe transplant shock. We very, very often see root slips die back to the soil level. Sometimes all the leaves will fall off, but just leave them in, give them time, and almost always they will regrow from a node at or above the soil level. Typically we end up with like 99% survival rate, but you got to give them a few weeks. So we recommend don't pull them out right away when they look like they're struggling. Give them a few weeks. If you're really not sure, you could kind of tug a little bit on the slip and make sure it's developing roots, but give them a little bit of time before you pull them out and replace them. The critical weed-free period for sweet potato is the first 6 to 8 weeks. So critical weed-free period is kind of a scientific term, which means the period of time where if you don't control weeds, you are going to lose significant amounts of yield. So for sweet potato, for 6 to 8 weeks, you have to be controlling weeds around the slips. Otherwise, you are going to see a significant loss in root yield at the end of the summer. All right, so actually before I get into sweet potato greens, I'm going to pause again if there's any questions about planting.
Yes, there's one left over from the previous section. Richard asks, has there been any testing of Georgia Jet or white yam sweet potatoes in the Pacific Northwest?
So not that I know of, no. But Georgia Jet is, I believe it was bred for the northern states, or at least is very popular in a lot of northern regions, but we have not done any testing on it.
I think there's some farmers on the peninsula who've tried Georgia Jet and had good luck with it.
Yeah, I think it'd be a great one to consider. It's for northern regions.
Yeah, we had 2 farms that ordered them last year, and unfortunately the slips came There was an issue when the slips got mailed and they came really dry and desiccated, so we didn't get much information from the Georgia Jet because, um, yeah, the slips had a rough journey.
Okay. Then there's some questions about how deep do they get planted and how deep would a raised bed have to be?
Oh, those are great questions. Okay, so our raised beds, I believe, are about 8 inches tall, but we definitely have those exact dimensions in our growing guide. And then, but I would say any amount of raising is probably going to help. So like 6 inches is probably going to be good for helping make harvest easier, warm the soil. And then the other question was how deep to plant the slips. So you want to make sure at least a couple of nodes are buried. So we usually cut our slips to have about 5 to 7 nodes total, and we try to bury at least 2 or 3 of those.
Okay. The next question is, if sweet potatoes are planted in a high tunnel, is there a high end temperature that should be avoided?
Hmm. Um, I am not sure you would get to it. I don't know, Jordan, do you know if there's an official, I guess it's probably at least 100 degrees, maybe even higher than that.
Yeah, I'm not sure on an official temperature, but I would agree that at some point above 100, you're probably just cooking the plant.
But I think it's pretty high. Sweet potatoes are a tropical plant, so they, I think, will tolerate a good amount of heat pretty well.
Okay. And then also there, how about the humidity? Is there a concern about humidity when they're growing?
Potentially, if it's really humid, I would think you could get some fungal issues, but that is not something we've ever had issues with in any of our trials or any of our on-farm trials.
Okay. But we do worry about humidity when producing slips and curing them, but you'll get to that later, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, for now, there are no more questions.
Awesome. Okay, so now we're going to talk about sweet potato greens. So I mentioned earlier, sweet potato vines are completely edible, which a lot of people in the United States don't know. But sweet potato vine tips are really commonly consumed in many parts of Asia, Africa, and the Pacific Islands. The vine tips are commonly sold in bunches, like you can see in these pictures, and they are commonly found in the United States at like Asian markets. So here's pictures in Honolulu and at the San Francisco Farmers Market. Typically, we see them sold for about $3 a bunch, and this is just what they look like. We do know of one farmer who has sold sweet potato greens in Washington. So this is Kendra, who has a farm on Vashon Island, and here's her sweet potato greens at her farm stand last summer. She loved selling sweet potato greens. She had customers coming back. She, interestingly, did not ever even harvest the sweet potato roots. She didn't have any interest in the roots. She was growing them just for the leaves, and found customers really loved them. And she was able to get $5 a bunch for them, which is really awesome. So we were kind of curious about if farmers could maybe get 2 crops out of the same plant. So if you could get both the vine tips and the roots out of the same plant, and then you'd have 2 crops. And so we did an experiment in 2023 and 2024, and we wanted to look at maybe if there was different times in the growing season, you could harvest the greens to have different impacts on root yield. So we did expect an impact on root yield because if you remove leaves, you're removing photosynthetic capability. And so we do expect that's going to lower root yield. But we were curious how much it was going to lower root yield and if it mattered when in the season we harvested the greens. So we had 4 treatments. We had a control treatment where we harvested no greens at all. We just harvested the roots. We had an early greens harvest treatment where we harvested greens at 2-week intervals 3 times throughout the month of August, which is the first time the vines are long enough to even be cutting for greens. And then we had a late harvest treatment where we looked at harvesting greens at the same 2-week intervals throughout September. And then we had a continuous harvest treatment where we looked at harvesting the greens 5 times all the way throughout August and September. So what we learned a few things. We learned that you can dual crop sweet potato for greens and roots. The vine tips can be harvested throughout the season. They do regrow and you can recut them at 2-week intervals. And the yield actually remains quite steady throughout the season. We found of our different greens harvest treatments, you get the most vines total if you harvest all throughout the season, which makes a lot of sense. There were more harvests. But we did see significant root yield loss for all treatments where we harvested greens. So the root yield loss we saw was between 50 and 60%. So it was very, very significant decline in root yield loss. So this is not a great option for a farmer who's primarily interested in roots. We also saw the root size decreased a little bit with greens harvest. And with regard to our different early, late, or continuous harvests, we found that harvesting the greens later it seemed to have a little bit less of an impact on both root yield and size. Then we were curious. So we knew that we lost root yield when we harvested greens, but the greens are also a profitable vegetable crop. And so we were curious how the economic returns would pan out thinking about these different yields. So we used the standard market prices we've heard for direct marketing, sweet potato roots at $3 a pound, and sweet potato greens at $3 a bunch. You can see this table is going to be a lot of numbers, but it's going to show the economic value in $1,000 per hectare. And we're going to look along the left at the different treatments. So you don't have to pay too much attention to these numbers, but it just shows the value of the greens harvested from 8 weeks after transplanting all the way to 16 weeks after transplanting. We've got some blank spaces because the treatments weren't harvested every week. And then here's the value of the roots at the end, accounting for those different root yields. And then I want you just to focus on the last column, so looking at the totals, so adding up the profit from the greens and the roots. So this is our control treatment. It was about 68.9 thousand per hectare if we didn't touch the greens at all, just harvested roots. And then interestingly, when harvesting the greens actually more than accounted for the loss in root yield. So the highest returns we saw were when the greens were continuously harvested, even though root yield dropped by about 60%. And then here's the same table, but just changing the price of the greens to what we saw on Vashon Island of $5 a bunch. It's the exact same pattern, but you can see now it's just even stronger. In this case, the continuous greens harvest yielded about twice the profit of harvesting only the roots. So greens can be a very, very profitable crop. You are going to lose root yield, but if you do have a market for the greens, this could be something you want to think about. And when it comes to marketing greens, we have 2 things we've developed that you are welcome to download from our website, use, modify however you want for marketing. We have a brochure about sweet potato greens with some fun facts about nutrition, some tips for cooking with sweet potato greens, and a recipe. And then we also have recipe cards, which you can download, which again have some tips on cooking with sweet potatoes and a recipe for a curry with sweet potato greens. But if you are not really interested in the vine tips that much, you want to grow your sweet potatoes just for roots, you're probably not going to want to touch the greens during the season too much. But at the end of the season, you are going to have a bunch of vines that you're just going to be cutting from the plant anyway. And so another option is to feed those to livestock. So sweet potatoes can be fed to livestock. We did a small feeding trial last year, and I think most of the animals in this picture liked them. I think the horse actually ended up not liking them that much, but this is a great option to try. We've had farmers try feeding the greens to pigs, chickens, cows. So it's something to consider if you have livestock. And then if you're in Western Washington, about the first week of October, you're going to be thinking about harvesting your sweet potato roots. You have a couple options. You can harvest them by hand, just with a shovel. Or if you're on a really large scale and you have access to a potato digger, that is how we harvest a lot of our plots, and it works great. The main things to think about are minimizing skinning and bruising during harvest, and trying to harvest before soil temps drop below 50. And I'm actually going to pause quickly if we have any questions on greens. I'm at the stop 1 slide ago.
I have no questions so far. I think it's Dove's Landing, Pacific Northwest, a farm out there said that their sheep love the sweet potato greens.
Oh, that's awesome.
Chickens also love them. And I don't see any questions right now, but I did put a link to the sweet potato page on the research station website so folks can access that resource.
Awesome. Okay, so back to harvest. So
actually, one more question.
Okay.
Sorry, late bloomers here. Okay, how do people eat the greens?
Those are great questions. So I don't, know exactly how people eat them around the world. I think there's a lot of uses. They're very important. But typically the way I tell people about them is you can use them any way you would use spinach. So you can eat them raw, you can cook them, you can saute them. Anything you would do with spinach, you could do with a sweet potato green. We do find the flavor seems to be a little less bitter than spinach. So if you happen to be someone who doesn't like the flavor of spinach that much, you might find sweet potato even a little more palatable. And sweet potato seems to hold up a little bit better after cooking. So sometimes spinach, if it's overcooked, could even get a little bit slimy. Sweet potato greens tend to be a little better after cooking.
Great. And folks have added information to the chat box about using them in stir fries and how they season them.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love them. I try to eat them a lot.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks everybody for pitching in with your ideas for cooking them. There is a question about what nutrients are in the greens.
Oh, that's awesome. So I will point you to maybe our resources on that, but they are extremely nutritious. They're like a typical dark leafy green, but actually have a lot of, really awesome nutrition. But I think if you look at our brochure, there's kind of a summary of nutrition there. And I
Okay.
also don't want to scare anyone with the root yield loss. If you don't want to impact your sweet potato root yield, but you just want to try the greens, it's not going to be an issue. Our trial was like pretty heavy harvest of sweet potato vine tips, thinking about that as a crop. So if you're, you just want to taste them, go for it. Don't worry too much about impact on root yield.
Okay, we're good to go.
So back to harvest. So main thing you want to do is make sure they're harvested before soil temperatures get below 50 Fahrenheit. That's where you're going to get cold damage. And if you are in a really warm area, you might potentially harvest them even earlier because they've gotten big enough. So those would be the only two reasons. You harvest once they're as big as you want them, or if else, you got to harvest them by the time the soil gets to 50, which for us, we aim for first 2 weeks of October. And then after you harvest them, you want to brush off the dirt and let the skin dry. So ideally, you're not going to wash them after harvest. Typically, we just brush the dirt off, let them dry, cure them. The ideal situation would be to wash them after storage right before you eat or sell them. However, if for some reason you have to wash them right after you harvest them, you can do it. It's not going to have a super major impact on storage life, but it will have a little bit of an impact. So that's why we recommend you avoid it if you can. But if you can't, you can wash them. Just make sure the skin dries before you move on to the next step, which is curing. So curing is really important for sweet potato. It is important for a few reasons. It helps heal wounds. So anything that was damaged during harvest, it will heal over. It forms a new layer of cells underneath the skin that helps reduce moisture loss and helps prevent pathogen entry so your roots don't rot in the winter. And it also promotes an enzyme reaction that converts starch into sugar and makes the roots taste sweeter. So to cure, the picture on the left shows what we do. We use a humidifier and a space heater in a small room to get to conditions of 80 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 to 90% relative humidity for 1 to 3 weeks. If you can't get to those conditions and you're like just a little bit cooler than that, it might just take a little bit longer, but it will work. It should work out. And then on the right is a picture. We've had farmers be creative in lots of different ways with their curing setups. Here's a photo of someone who used a small closet, some trays of water, and a small heater, and that worked great. And so if you're not quite sure if your curing is done or if you need a little more time, a few ways you can tell if you're done curing. First of all, you'll see that the wounds have healed over. So any wounds that appeared at harvest, they should be healed over with kind of a white layer of cells. When you first harvest sweet potatoes, they skin really, really easily. So if you were to just kind of brush your finger along a freshly harvested sweet potato root, you'll just peel the skin right off. But after curing, that will not happen. So you will notice that the skin adheres much more tightly to the root. And then another great indicator is just to taste them. If they don't taste like quite good enough to you yet, just let them cure a little bit longer and they should sweeten up. So curing is really important for storage life. We were curious how important it was, so we did a trial this fall where we looked at curing roots versus just storing them in an unheated garage without curing. Along the bottom, you can see 3 different size classes of sweet potatoes. So the left is the largest one, and then the right is the smallest one. And then we're looking at roots in good condition after 3 months. So after 3 months of storage, the blue bars are the roots that were cured. 100% of them across all size classes were still in great condition. But the orange bars show if they were not cured. The largest roots held on a little better. 60% of those were not rotten yet at 3 months. But across the smaller sizes, 95 to almost 100% of them were rotted after 3 months. So curing is really, really important for long-term storage. And for long-term storage, we use the same room we cure our sweet potatoes in. We typically just turn the heater down or off to get to temperatures closer to 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Still maintain often pretty high humidity, but it's not quite as important as during curing. And then you can store for 6 to 12 months as long as they were properly cured. So we still have sweet potatoes from last fall. They would last easily into this fall if we wanted. So this is kind of the end. So we've got some growing resources you can take a look at. We've got our growing guide, which is being updated right now, and the new version should be out in the next few weeks. We've got our YouTube channel where we post recordings of previous workshops like this one. This recording will go up there. And then we have some short videos on things like planting. And we have some new videos that will be going up in the next few weeks. And then we have our website where you can always find links to everything that we've published. And here we have, again, our website where you can find everything, and then all of our emails. And I think at this point, we will answer any remaining questions.
Thanks so much, Laura. Folks should feel free to put your questions in the chat box. There is one there right now, and that is, how deep do the mature roots go? And perhaps you can talk a little bit about harvesting tools.
Yeah, so it does depend a little bit on the variety. Some varieties stay really nice in this, gorgeous little bunch, and I would say maybe about 8 inches, 8 to 10 inches deep. But we do have some varieties that like to spread quite a bit more and can actually get quite out into the rows. You'll learn as you start to harvest. So we usually, start really carefully, and you'll pretty much always end up crunching a root in half as you kind of learn each variety and how far it spreads. But typically I would say maybe about 10 inches deep. And then as far as harvesting tools, I don't know, Laura, if you have anything specific other than we typically use a shovel.
Yeah, if there's any farmers on that may have undercutters that they use for other crops, what, I guess, if you can say anything about that, what you use at the research station.
Oh yeah, so we also use our potato digger, which gets, I think we set it at like 12-inch depth, and it works for most roots. There's a few varieties, and in some plants it ends up cutting the roots in half, but for almost everything, a 12-inch depth works pretty well.
Okay. The next question is, there's a sweet potato greens enthusiast. Which variety produces the most amount of leaves?
Oh, that's a great question. We have not done a trial on that. So our trial on greens is actually only on 3 breeding lines, which are wireworm resistant, not released yet. So I don't know for sure which variety would produce the most greens. What I can say is, for greens, you're looking at vine tips. And so what you're probably going to want is a variety that produces a lot of vines, like in number. And those tend to be those more upright varieties. They tend to produce shorter vines, but more vines. And that is probably going to help you get more vine tips.
Next question is, do sweet potatoes need to be stored in the dark?
So not to the extent that potatoes do. So regular potatoes can produce a toxin if they're exposed to light. Sweet potatoes are not like that. Darkness is not essential, but we typically store in the dark. It's probably generally what we'd recommend, but it's not the same as potatoes where they absolutely have to be in the dark.
Okay. Next question is, would you recommend putting slips in pots in the spring in the greenhouse, then transplanting them later when the soil warms?
So what we recommend, so Sammy mentioned pre-rooting and a few cases where you might want to do that. But what we do is when our slips are large enough, I just move the whole tray, so I don't cut anything yet. I move all my slips just out to a hoop house, and so they've cooled down a lot. They typically just stop growing, and they'll just sit for a month or so, and then I let them sit there, and I cut them just right before harvest. It seems to be, that's kind of standard planting practice, saves you a lot of labor transplanting, and then you avoid misshapen roots from pre-rooting.
Let's see. The next question is, what sort of fertilizers are used, or what are the nutrient requirements?
So we have details on that in our growing guide, and you'll probably want to wait for our updated version because we did a great, we really changed our fertilizer section because we were told it was not very helpful. But basically we do about 100 pounds an acre of nitrogen. Potassium is a little bit higher. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. But we primarily fertilize to 100 pounds an acre of nitrogen. But more details in the upcoming growing guide.
Okay. Let's see. I also wanted to mention when you were talking about curing, is it correct that the curing conditions are similar for winter squash?
Yes, that is correct. And we learned from some farmers last year, some of them have cured sweet potatoes with great success in the exact same room they cure their winter squash. And then if you only have one space and you've already figured out winter squash, you can probably just put your sweet potatoes in the same area and it will work great.
Yeah, and if you aren't curing your winter squash, you should do that too, because it helps them as well. So, okay. Next question is, how do you get slips?
Yeah, so you can order them in the mail. You can produce them yourself from roots that you've sprouted in a greenhouse or in a windowsill. Yeah, so those are the two main options. Order them, or if you are looking for some this year in like a small amount, you might be able to contact us and we might be able to get you a few. But reach out, let us know what you're looking for. We might be able to get you some slips.
Yeah. It seems like more and more of the major seed companies that folks are ordering seeds from have sweet potato slips available. And they'll start delivering those in midway May, I think. You just need to check on when they deliver those. So if you want varieties that, they're depending on the seed catalog, they have different varieties you might want to try.
And if you email me, I can let you know. I've gotten a lot of feedback from farmers on seed companies that they had great experiences with ordering slips and ones they had terrible experiences. So if you're just looking for some suggestions, I can let you know what farmers have told me.
Yeah. And we also, the reason that we are teaching folks on about how to grow sweet potato slips is because that's a great way to avoid importing new diseases to your garden or your farm. There are some folks that have gotten diseases with their sweet potato slips, and if you grow your sweet potatoes at home or on your farm and then produce your own slips, you know where your slips are coming from. Just a side note for integrated pest management. Let's see. Okay, next question is, can they be grown from sweet potatoes from the store?
So yeah, lots of people I know have grown them, have sprouted slips. The issue is you don't necessarily know what variety you're getting. But if it's a standard orange one, it's probably Covington or Beauregard. I don't think you would have any issues with that. That should do great out here. If it's like a purple one, there's a chance some of those are really long season cultivars and they just might not yield that well out here, but I think it's certainly worth trying.
And you should also know that if you plan on selling the sweet potato slips or anything like that, there are some sweet potatoes that are trademarked.
Yeah, so we have in our growing guide a list of all the sweet potatoes varieties that we recommend that are still currently under patent. So those patents typically last 20 years, and after that point, you can propagate them freely. So some like Beauregard are now not under patent anymore, but a lot of the newer ones like Covington are still under patent. So you're not supposed to sell those or propagate on a farm.
Yep. Okay. There's just a couple comments in the chat box. Somebody said George's sweet potatoes already sent theirs, so that person already received theirs. And then another person says Territorial Seeds sends them out according to your planting zone.
Oh, awesome.
Yep.
So now I'm thinking if that question earlier about slip storage in pots, if you're referring to like, let's say you got your sweet potato slips in the mail this week and you can't plant them yet because it's too early, I would put those I would bury only about an inch of each slip in potty mix. I would get like a big 5-gallon pot and put all my like 200 slips in the same pot. So just a little bit of the stem and just let them sit there. You can water them. That'll keep them alive for like 3 or 4 weeks. And then right before planting, what I would do is cut directly above the soil level and replant the rest of that slip without roots. So if that is what that question was getting at, that would be a good option.
Yep. And then also they should not put them in the refrigerator.
You should never ever put them in the refrigerator. Yes, they're very cold sensitive.
Yep. All right. If folks have any more questions, feel free to put those in the chat box, or at this point you can probably unmute yourself and just ask out loud. But thank you so much for joining us. We'll likely have more sweet potato presentations in the future. We're updating the growing guide. You'll be able to find that on the research station website, which I put a link to that in the chat box, and you'll get a link. Actually, there's a link right there up on the screen, and we'll also email it to you. You'll find all the resources there.